My wife was preparing for a business trip that was supposed to propel her up the career ladder, but I already knew in advance that this was a trap. The fact is that my wife agreed to spend the night with one of the clients and wanted to do it all in secret from me. How naive she is. My name is Tommy Jansen, and I consider myself an average Scandinavian man. Earlier this year, in my early 40s, I believed I was free from personal issues, happily married. However, the events that led me to write this story began to unfold. Despite considering myself anything but weak, I gradually realized that my wife exerted increasing control over our lives. To a large extent, this was my own doing. Far too often I chose the path of least resistance, yielding to her in matters I deemed unimportant. Yet I began to notice these differences in opinion occurring more frequently, prompting me to take a stand and put an end to it before it became the norm. Sandra, my charming 39-year-old wife, employed a straightforward strategy. She provided affection and delicious meals when things aligned with her preferences, but withheld them when I voiced objections and didn't yield to her wishes. Yet my primary motivation for taking the path of least resistance often stemmed from being too preoccupied to deal with such daily affairs. I worked as an engineer at the local branch of a nationwide construction company in a Scandinavian county capital, and my job kept me quite busy. During the summers, I would spend time at the golf club, much to Sandra's displeasure. Last year, I devoted a lot of time to the Reader Club stable, where our 13-year-old daughter Lina kept her horse, a gift from Sandra's parents. Since Sandra was afraid of horses, she insisted that I accompany Lina and assist with horse care. Initially, I wasn't keen on the idea, but my visits to the stable became enjoyable thanks to Marie Ann, an attractive and laid-back mother of one of the other young girls at the club. Marie Ann, whose horse was stabled next to Lina's, patiently taught me about horses since my knowledge was limited to distinguishing their front and rear ends. In return, I helped her with the heavy tasks, as her husband claimed to be allergic to horses and avoided the stable. We had a great time together, but our relationship remained platonic, with no hint of an affair. I couldn't help but feel a rush of excitement when one day she chuckled at a clever joke I had shared, saying, "If we were both single, I'd have you wrapped around my finger in seconds." My hopeful expression must have been evident because she quickly added that she was currently frustrated with her husband, asking, "Are you as charming at home as you are here?" I suggested she find out if we were both single, to which she agreed. Sandra and I were financially comfortable, allowing us to enjoy a pleasant lifestyle. With my good connections at the bank, I had invested in a house in a desirable neighborhood where we had many friends. Many of our acquaintances admired me, only seeing Sandra's charming side as the perfect hostess during our gatherings. Sandra and I first crossed paths while queuing at the check-in counter of the nearest airport during a holiday trip to the Spanish island of Majorca. We were both there with our respective groups of friends, and our paths crossed several times at various party spots on the island. It was during one of these encounters that I managed to exchange numbers with her. Subsequently, I called her, inviting her to a romantic dinner at a nice restaurant, which led to a spontaneous encounter against a palm tree in a park. That moment marked the beginning of our love story, which persisted even after our return from the island. Sandra's elite entourage was with us all the time during our vacation in Spain, but upon returning home they refused to recognize me as Sandra's boyfriend. In Spain, they did not hesitate to communicate with my friends, including those from humble families. However, upon returning home, many of them openly expressed the belief that everything that happened on the Mediterranean island should remain there. And as you probably understood, my relationship with her friends was not going very well. Some people viewed me poorly because of my T first name and my upbringing in a notorious part of our city, despite the fact that the area was perfectly fine when I was growing up there, and my respectable job and current lifestyle held no significance to them. I was pleased that Sandra never shared the sentiments of her snobbish upper-class friends. While Sandra may have been seen as a status symbol by others, I never saw her that way. To me, she was simply a wonderful girl who happened to come from a wealthier background. After a few months, she experienced complications with her medication, and her doctor advised her to take a break from it. However, our frequent intimacy and occasional forgetfulness about having condoms at home inevitably led to one outcome: her unexpected pregnancy a few months later. We decided to marry quickly, as we both wanted to do so before the arrival of our child. I was relieved that her parents had no objections. Sandra's parents, recognizing her as their only child, gave her as a wedding gift an extravagant summer house on the shore of a picturesque lake near our hometown, which became her private property. This thoughtful gesture not only secured Sandra's ownership of the summer house, but also freed me from the onerous responsibility of maintaining it. Despite the transfer of ownership, Sandra's parents retained the privilege of using the summer house at their discretion. Before our marriage, I possessed our townhouse, which I retained as my personal asset in exchange for Sandra's summer house. Apart from these individual properties, we shared everything else, with no distinction between my house and your house. I held great admiration for Sandra's parents. Having successfully managed a furniture factory, they eventually sold it for a handsome sum and acquired a beautiful residence in Marbella, southern Spain, upon her father's 60th birthday. While I enjoyed our visits to Marbella, Sandra harbored a distaste for the sweltering climate, prompting me to anticipate potential challenges if she were to inherit the property. Sandra had recently been promoted to a vice department head for special projects at the district office of one of the leading insurance companies. Unfortunately, I noticed a negative impact on our marriage as a result. She seemed different, and when I inquired about any issues, she attributed her increased fatigue solely to the demands of her new role. She assured me things would improve once she became more proficient. Despite no clear evidence of infidelity, such as overtime, provocative attire, or suspicious calls, our intimacy suffered due to her changed demeanor. The only indication was her strong reaction to my jest about a potential affair following a disappointing Saturday night. She rarely discussed her work at home, but for the past 2 weeks she had been boasting about handling a very significant contract. Despite claiming to trust me completely, she hadn't shared any further details about her project. While I was aware of many events in our city and could make educated guesses, I didn't pry into it since it didn't concern me greatly. Then, on a Tuesday evening, Sandra returned home from work, looking troubled. Immediately sensing something was amiss, I asked, "What's wrong? Did you lose your job?" "Of course not. Quite the opposite, actually. We've nearly finalized our major project with a successful deal." I was so familiar with her that I immediately noticed something was troubling her. She was far from being in a cheerful mood despite the successful deal. I said, "Please don't try to deceive me. I can sense that something is bothering you." "Yes, you're partly right, because I have another important project on my mind, and it's connected to the first one." "Well, such things do happen. What seems to be the issue?" "The second project requires travel out of town, possibly overnight stays now and then. The first trip is scheduled for this Friday, if you're okay with it." I had a strange feeling about the buried dog when she tried to share the good news about a successful deal. But before she mentioned her main problem, a strange business meeting on Friday evening, which would arouse the suspicions of any sane person. She didn't seem happy about divulging this trivial question, so I asked, "Where are we going?" Sandra disclosed the name of a small coastal town just 45 kilometers away, connected to us by a decent road. This revelation nearly knocked me out of my chair with surprise. Now I started to suspect she had gotten herself into some serious trouble. Nevertheless, I maintained the facade of ignorance and asked, "Planning to stay overnight there when it's only a half-hour drive back?" "Our client's responsible manager won't be available until 5 o'clock, and we'll need some time to inspect the property before we can finalize the initial deal. Afterward, I'll be responsible for hosting him at dinner, as my company has arranged at the Seaside Inn, to commemorate our first deal and discuss future business opportunities. There's nothing unusual about that." Although I anticipated her response, I inquired, "What type of property are you planning to visit, considering your background in economics?" "It's a sizable leisure area with 45 holiday chalets." It turns out my suspicions were right all along. Sandra had been involved in business with Oscar Pielborg, who clearly had taken advantage of Sandra and her incompetent boss. I've known Oscar since we were kids, growing up in the same area. Back when he was a car salesman, Oscar sold a car to the daughter of the local slumlord, befriended her, and eventually married her. After they had 2 children, their marriage evolved into some sort of unconventional open arrangement, with her secretly dating other women and Oscar, boasting about his affairs with various, often married women at his leisure spot where he owned a well-equipped chalet. Oscar and his wife had a mutual agreement to keep all their extramarital activities discreet and away from their hometown. Oscar was warmly embraced by his wealthy wife's family, as the son of the slumlord lacked the intellect to contribute to the expanding family enterprise. However, Oscar possessed the ruthlessness required to excel in that business. Being deeply involved in the local construction industry, I had heard numerous rumors about Oscar's activities. It was known that he recently acquired an entire area, with approximately 500 somewhat dilapidated apartments from the community. These apartments couldn't afford the costly upkeep, and the community wanted to dissociate themselves from the negative reputation of owning a property in rapid decline, bordering on becoming a full-fledged slum. Oscar, on the other hand, never encountered such issues. I opted to continue participating in her plan for a bit longer and remarked, "This does seem like quite an unusual situation. Will the dinner truly last the entire night? How many colleagues from your office will be attending?" "Just me this time, and there will be some fine wine as part of this significant celebratory dinner. Do you really want me to risk driving under the influence?" "Just you? Are you confident in your ability to assess those 45 dilapidated chalets, each in varying states of disrepair? I could accompany you and assist, of course, at no charge, and afterward I can drive you home following your dinner." "This isn't a final survey, just a quick assessment to gather more project information. Thanks, but I prefer to handle my responsibilities independently." "And have you never considered taxis? They're still operational in this country and might even be a more cost-effective option for your company than booking a room at a seaside hotel." She started to show signs of discomfort as she realized she was backing herself into a corner during our disagreement. Nevertheless, she persisted, "I can stay at Augustu's in the recreational area for free and receive compensation for both my overtime and a living allowance." "Who's insisting that you travel there on a Friday night? Is it your boss, the client, or is it your own suggestion?" "Naturally, my boss. He intended to deal with it himself, but he had other things to do, so he invited me to represent our company in this important transaction. It is an honor for me to take on such a responsibility, and there is no need for you to interfere in my affairs." At that moment, I could no longer restrain myself and exclaimed, "What a pleasure it is to be the object of manipulation by that scoundrel Oscar Pichelborg and star in his adult films for a meager fee. Is self-sacrifice a prerequisite for promotion in this company? For your information, there are hidden cameras everywhere in Oscar's apartment." My outburst stunned her and left her speechless. I kept insisting, "Oscar used to share his latest movies with his buddies at the golf club, and I have no doubt that your debut performance will be the talk of the whole city among his friends and colleagues. Oscar and I both belong to the same golf club, where he bragged about his hidden cameras in the apartment for the night, where he probably wanted to invite Sandra for business negotiations. In the recreation area, he had a well-equipped private chalet with an office and a guest room connected to his own bedroom. One day he proudly showed his friends and fans at the golf club photos of him, serving the wife of the owner of the painting business after business negotiations about a maintenance job. He showed me these photos and even offered me the opportunity to meet her if I was more interested in collaborating with him. I suggested that he go on a permanent vacation to a hotter place. Oscar loudly stated that such photos serve as the strongest aphrodisiac since the women depicted in them, as a rule, agreed to repeat business meetings after viewing the photos and receiving his word of honor that only he and no one else would never see them again if they behaved well. It was a kind of blackmail on his part. I found it somewhat surprising that he had the audacity to attempt his schemes on my wife Sandra. However, it could have been a retaliatory move against me, as my company had declined to engage in any questionable or unauthorized tasks for him. He held me accountable for this and had made veiled threats about repayment with interest during our encounters at the golf club. Oscar's reputation for underhanded tactics was widely known within business circles, and it should have been familiar even to Sandra's boss. Learning that her boss, whom I considered a despicable individual, had somehow convinced my conservative wife to spend a night at Oscar's chalet in exchange for securing a contract nearly floored me. Sandra was not naive. She must have comprehended the implications of spending a night with Oscar. At the moment, she was sitting at the table, tears streaming down her face. "This is not what you imagine. It's not like that at all." "No, it's much worse. Maybe it's a complete disaster. But if you're determined to be with that disgusting jerk Oscar, then our marriage is over. Do you understand that?" She was silent, so I raised my voice. "Do you understand that if you sleep with Oscar, our marriage is over?" She nodded. Grabbing the phone book, I called Oscar's mother, posing as an old friend, and found out his home number. After dialing it, his wife replied, "Emily Pischelborg." I disclosed my true identity to her and mentioned that I was a construction engineer with a pressing matter to discuss with her husband. Politely, I inquired if my friend Oscar was present. Upon learning he was at the golf club, I thanked her for the information. Despite Sandra's continued loud sobbing, I informed her of the urgency of my business and proceeded toward the door. Sandra appeared stunned by my uncharacteristic demeanor, clearly taken aback by this unexpected change. However, I felt compelled to act differently, feeling overwhelmed like the proverbial camel with a broken back. As I reached for the car door, Sandra called out from the entrance, urging me not to do anything reckless or bother Mr. Pilborg. She threatened divorce if I dared to proceed. I headed straight for the golf club, gathering intel on when Oscar and two others had teed off. Anticipating Oscar to be around holes 14 or 15, I set off in that direction. Finding them on the green of number 15, Oscar spotted me from afar and grasped my intent. He dropped his club and bolted. It took nearly 100 meters to catch up and subdue him. No time for debates. I unleashed my fury on him, intent on settling the score for the havoc he wreaked on my marriage. He deserved every blow and then some. Aware of the ticking clock before his cohorts intervened, I made sure to make it a day he'd never forget. I knocked him down with a couple of hard punches, and I also managed to land a couple more punches before his friends and several other players prevented me. I warned them not to interfere and headed to the clubhouse where I parked my car. As I reached the clubhouse, I found a police car with two young officers waiting for me. They politely offered me the option of cooperating peacefully, to which I agreed, and I got into the back seat of their car without much conversation. The journey to the police station was quiet, and upon arrival I was escorted to a small office where another officer proceeded to question me extensively. I narrated the incident involving my childhood friend, Oscar, who harbored envy towards me due to my beautiful wife. He had the audacity to suggest that she engage in inappropriate acts to secure his business contract. Continuing, I recounted our encounter at the golf club, where he attempted to isolate me for a confrontation. Fortunately, I managed to fend off his aggressive advances. Though I doubted the officer fully believed my account, he recorded it nonetheless. After signing my statement, I was detained while he contacted a prosecutor. Approximately 5 hours later, I was released from custody and escorted back to the clubhouse by a police patrol. I was aware that my chances of avoiding a trial were quite high, as such cases often accumulated in a backlog, and if no action had been taken within 2 years, the case would be dismissed. When I returned to the house, Sandra was still in the kitchen. She asked, "Where were you?" "At the police station." "The police station? What on earth were you doing there?" "Not much, just answering their questions about what happened to your friend Oscar at the golf club." Suddenly, her face went pale, and she exclaimed, "Oh my God, what did you do to Oscar Pilborg?" "Not my fault that he's such a fragile creep. He attacked me and ended up in the hospital." Admittedly, my account veered from reality, but I felt compelled to stick to the narrative I presented to the police, just in case they pursued inquiries at her workplace and questioned her colleagues. Sandra glanced at me, tears welling in her eyes, and uttered softly, "I'll sleep in the spare room tonight." I listened as she secured the spare room door from within, realizing that our marriage had seen far happier days. The next morning, Sandra rose early, and the only words she spoke to me before heading to work were about the need for a serious conversation that evening. I nodded in agreement. When I started my new job, my initial task was reaching out to the lawyer who had previously handled some matters for the company. Known for his toughness and effectiveness, we had developed a friendship over the years. He agreed to assist me in pursuing Sandra's employer. Within 30 minutes, he called me back, arranging a meeting with the district chief at Sandra's workplace for that very afternoon. Promptly at 2 o'clock, my lawyer and I were escorted to the district chief's office, where both he and Sandra's boss awaited our arrival. It's clear that the insurance company directors held my lawyer in high regard, as they conceded to many of his points. Sandra's boss appeared very fearful, and my lawyer intimidated him into admitting that, despite being aware of Oscar's reputation, he had insisted that Sandra accompany Oscar for a superficial survey of the chalets, winning and dining, and then spend the night with Oscar. He denied discussing any vulgar actions, but my lawyer argued that even a fool would understand Oscar's expectations. The boss was sweating when my lawyer accused him of facilitating illegal activities and outlined the legal consequences of such use of women. We even entered into an agreement, stipulating their termination of the deal with Oscar Pielborg and covering all the costs for my attorney. I'm uncertain whether pursuing the matter in court would have yielded anything beyond substantial expenses for myself. However, the district chief of the insurance company recognized that the backlash from negative publicity would far outweigh any financial gains. I believe the DC acknowledged that I had done them a significant favor by persuading them to terminate Oscar's contract. I'm convinced that Sandra's team had conducted an extremely poor negotiation with the adept con man, Oscar Pielborg. The department chair comprehended that their headquarters had blamed him for the entire debacle of their unfavorable contract with Oscar, resulting in significant financial losses. Sandra's incompetent supervisor was a longtime acquaintance whom he had hired outside the standard procedures. It would be unreasonable for any sensible department head to assign Sandra such a challenging task, involving a notorious troublemaker like Oscar, for her initial important assignment. Evidently, both the department chair and Sandra's supervisor were swayed more by her charm than her qualifications for the position. If they had received or anticipated any personal favors from Sandra for her promotion, I presume they would be somewhat dismayed upon learning about what I did to Oscar. After the meeting, I called a friend at the insurance company my employer used to work with. I informed him that Oscar Pielborg's discounted insurance for his new housing development had been revoked and would soon be available again. He assured me of a generous bonus if they secured the contract. Sandra's demeanor upon returning home from work that evening made a provoked tiger seem tame in comparison. Frankly, amidst her yelling, I couldn't make out much of what she said, but it was clear that she didn't consider me a beloved husband, at least for the moment. She hastily packed a suitcase, mentioned something about the summer house, and stormed out. Our daughter, Lena, was understandably frightened by her mother's behavior. However, as Sandra didn't ask her to accompany her to the summer house, Lena remained with me without asking any further questions. We went to the stable where I encountered Marie-Anne, sporting a small yet noticeable black eye. She confided in me that her husband had struck her during a heated dispute over the credit card bills accrued from his online poker ventures. Sharing with her the news of Sandra relocating to her summer house because I intervened to prevent her from spending the night with a client in his chalet, Marie-Anne embraced me tightly, culminating in our first kiss. As I held her, she posed the question, "Don't you think we would face fewer issues if we lived together instead of with our spouses?" I responded with a simple yes, and sealed it with a passionate kiss. In that moment, both of us felt a sense of relief, knowing we had an alternative if our marriages were to dissolve. Upon returning from the stable, I retreated to my study to check the burglar alarm at Sandra's summer house. The aging security system, safeguarding doors, windows, and equipped with motion sensors indoors, was linked to the phone line. As expected, Sandra was home and had deactivated it. However, there was also new equipment positioned outside the house. which I had set up to assess its performance in our climate before purchasing several similar installations for my work. When anything, a car or a person, approached within 50 meters of the house, it triggered a digital camera concealed within a simulated bird's nest box. This camera captured images of the approaching object and transmitted alerts and images to my cell phone via GPRS on the new high-speed 3G network. Since this equipment was part of a work-related test, Sandra never inquired about its operation when I obtained her permission to conduct the test there. Although I paid little attention to it on Wednesday and Thursday evenings, I noticed that her car was the only one parked outside the summer house. After finishing work on Friday, I ran some errands and then accompanied Lena to the supermarket for groceries before preparing dinner. Since Sandra hadn't attempted to reach out since her departure, I decided not to contact her either. Instead, I eagerly anticipated meeting Marie-Anne at the stables on Saturday. Around 6:30, my cell phone alarm went off, and upon checking the camera feed, I spotted a silver metallic Lexus SUV parked alongside Sandra's car. Knowing that the only Lexus SUV in town belonged to Oscar, I realized that trouble was brewing. Given that Lena, at 13, was accustomed to being home alone for short periods, especially on sunny summer evenings, she understood my absence. With minimal traffic, I reached the summer house in under 30 minutes, parking in a spot where my car couldn't be seen. Quietly, I approached the house, unlocked the front door with my key, and entered. There was no one in the house, in the spacious living room, but I heard a woman screaming from the master bedroom. I turned on the recording function on my mobile phone and went over to her. Outside the room, I heard Sandra screaming, "No, no, no! I've never agreed to anything like this." Then a man's voice rang out. "Shut up. Max promised me to have a good time, and I'll show you what it means." Sandra replied, "You've already received more than enough. Stop it, please." Oscar's voice, full of anger because the woman wasn't listening to him, rang out, "Ordinary intimacy is boring. When I say have a good time, it means whatever I want." The next sound coming from the bedroom was the sharp sound of a hand hitting something hard. After making enough audio recordings, I quickly switched my mobile phone to camera mode by selecting the best picture setting, which allowed me to take 9 pictures at the touch of a button. As I understood it, Sandra had already satisfied Oscar, but he demanded something else and she was already against it. I decided that he would pay dearly for his actions towards the girl. I understood that my marriage was ruined, but I will not tolerate a woman being treated like this. Unnoticed by Sandra and Oscar, I entered the room. They discovered me only when the camera flash illuminated the space. They were both lying on the bed. Oscar, sporting a black eye and a bruise on his cheek from our previous encounter, lay as if nothing had happened. Before Oscar had time to realize the situation, I hid the phone and struck a powerful blow. I continued to work with my hands until he stopped his feeble attempts to defend himself. Although he was conscious, he offered no resistance when I grabbed his ankles and dragged him to the car. Placing it so that the license plate was visible, I took out my phone, switched it to video mode, pressed the record button, unzipped my trousers, and began to pour yellow liquid over Oscar. He didn't make the slightest attempt to escape, even when the yellow liquid splattered his face. When I finished, I warned him that if he dared to spread rumors that he had slept with my wife, this humiliation would be broadcast on the internet. In the end, I shouted at him to get out, otherwise he would have to face the consequences in the form of a crashed car. When he didn't obey immediately, I grabbed a large rock and threw it at the windshield, causing it to shatter. Oscar quickly jumped into the car. Although I was aware that my actions were the actions of a psychopath, my contempt for people who treat women so inappropriately, in my opinion, justified them. In the eyes of most, I just gave him what he deserved. Now Oscar was forced to remain silent, otherwise he would be disgraced all over the internet. When I returned to the house, I found that Sandra was already taking a shower, and the door was locked. Looking around the bedroom, I noticed that her clothes and Oscar's belongings were neatly arranged on chairs on opposite sides of the bed. I took some photos and tried to recreate the scene as if there had been an attack and that Sandra really needed help. I did this in case Oscar went to the police. I grabbed a plastic trash bag and threw Oscar's stuff into it. Then I wrote a short note to Sandra. "Dear Sandra, I swore to end our marriage if you cheat on me with that bastard Oscar. Well, now you've got what you wanted. Tommy." Anticipating that she would stay in the shower until I left, I took my bag and headed straight to Oscar. The garage door stood open, yet Oscar's car remained out of sight. With my bag in hand, I approached the front door and rang the bell. When Oscar's wife greeted me, I handed her the bag and recounted the truth of how I stumbled upon these items in the master bedroom of my summer house. Then, I wove a somewhat fabricated tale about poor Oscar fleeing in haste, leaving behind my unclothed wife and his possessions, only to trip on the doorstep, likely injuring himself. Much to my surprise, she offered a smile and expressed gratitude for my care of his belongings. Upon returning home, I informed Lena that her mother and I were experiencing difficulties and would likely reside separately for the time being. However, I assured her that she could still spend time with either of us as she wished. She responded that it was fine with her, citing several of her friends who lived with separated parents, and noted that it typically worked out without issues. Later, I reasoned that it wouldn't hurt if Sandra's parents heard my side of the story first. So, I called them in Spain and explained that I had discovered Sandra with Oscar Pielborg, one of the most notorious individuals in town, at her summer house. I conveyed that our marriage was irreparable because of this. I made it clear that regardless of what Sandra and I went through, Lena remained their granddaughter just as before. At the stables on Saturday, I confided in Marie Ann that I was now contemplating being single, although it would take 6 months to finalize it legally. I shared what I had discovered at Sandra's summer house. However, I refrained from urging her to leave her husband, as that decision had to be hers alone. Upon returning home, I found Sandra seated at the kitchen table, clearly distressed. It was evident that she had good reason to be. She expressed a desire to talk, and I was willing to listen. I informed her that further explanation wasn't necessary, as I'd already heard Oscar and her discuss what I needed to know, and it was all recorded. The evidence I'd gathered from what I'd seen and captured in photos was more than sufficient proof of her infidelity. She grasped that discussing forgiveness wasn't appropriate at the moment, sparing me from such efforts. Instead, we addressed crucial matters concerning Lena, along with other practical and financial issues, agreeing to reconvene in a week to devise a new plan. Upon reconvening a week later, we discovered that our opinions on most matters were only slightly divergent, and within less than 2 hours, we had signed the divorce papers. After she left the house, I felt a mixture of relief and surprise at how smoothly everything had gone. I couldn't shake the strange suspicion that Sandra, for some unknown reason, was just as eager to be rid of me as I was of her. She didn't object to sharing custody of Lena, who primarily stayed with me but visited Sandra whenever she wanted. It took me some time to comprehend why Sandra allowed that jerk Oscar to spend time with her at the summer house. Then, a clue emerged from the hidden camera outside her summer house, revealing her boss as a frequent nighttime visitor. After learning about their affair, I contacted their district chief and asked him about his attitude to the fact that the head of the department enters into a relationship with an employee and potentially contributes to her acquaintance with the client. To my surprise, the district attorney informed me that he had already discussed the matter with Mr. Spielberg and did not care at all what his staff did in their free time. I expressed my intention to find another solution. 3 days later, I confronted the head of the department in his office, accusing him of having a relationship with my wife before our divorce and faking her affair with Oscar. He cheekily laughed it off, asking what I could do about it. I demonstrated exactly what I was capable of. After a couple of my signature punches, all his brutality went away somewhere. Before I left, I warned him that one message to the authorities would be enough, and the whole scandal would get into the yellow press. After that visit, the only subsequent event was a call from Sandra, whose tone resembled that of a furious dog. I responded with brief, polite affirmations like, "Yes, dear," though they failed to improve her mood. At the stable with Marie Ann, I found myself unsure of what to do. While I wished for her to leave her husband and come to my home, I recognized that this decision had to be hers alone. When she inquired whether I had started dating, I admitted that I hadn't. Then she asked, "What if I left my husband? I'd believe the best outcome would be with you. Can I rely on you?" Yes. The topic wasn't broached again for the rest of the week until she called me at work one day. She revealed that the owner of the local gambling shop had informed her about her husband's debts. When she confronted her husband about it at his workplace, they had a heated argument, culminating in him threatening violence upon returning home from work, leaving her too afraid to go back. I brought along a skilled carpenter from one of our construction sites and met her outside her house. She gathered her 2 children and all her essentials without any issues. Once at my place, I offered her and her children the master bedroom so they could stay together on their first night, which I knew must be tough for them. Marie-Anne and I refrained from intimacy until after she had made the decision to divorce her husband and signed the papers. He planned to contest it, but it was seen as a futile gesture. In the meantime, we rearranged the house to give both of Marie-Anne's children their own rooms. We were delighted to see that Lena and Theresa, who knew each other from the riveting club, were already acting like sisters in many ways. And her son Alexander and I quickly became friends. I took on the role of his soccer dad. During our first bedtime meeting, Marie-Anne and I had an unforgettable experience. Our bond was tender. Overwhelmed with happiness, Marie-Anne shed tears of joy when she told me that she and her husband had not received something like this in the last 5 or 6 years. We both admitted that we dreamed about that night long before it came true. It was a comfort to me to realize that our love for each other did not lead to the breakup of our marriages, allowing us to meet new love without reproach after the breakup of our unions. Sandra and I had an extensive, solemn conversation when we met at a cafe to address some issues concerning Lena. Even though I already knew everything about her infidelity and didn't pursue further details or inquire about her relationships with Oscar and Max, Sandra surprised me by admitting that ruining our marriage was the most foolish decision she'd ever made. She deeply regretted it because she missed me and our family life immensely, acknowledging that she had lost me forever. The confession followed a typical narrative. It all started with the fact that she and Max often went to lunch at various restaurants, gradually developing a close personal connection without any vulgar involvement at the initial stage. It wasn't until Max hinted at her promotion to his deputy, with a promising chance of succeeding him as district chief, that things escalated. They marked the occasion with lunch at a small hotel where Max had arranged a room, and they took the afternoon off. Though she felt remorse upon returning home, the allure of anticipated promotions and the prospect of being the first woman in such a high-ranking position in their district office dulled her guilt. She didn't have feelings for Max, had no plans to leave me, and saw him only as a close friend and mentor. Their weekly intimacy became a part of their arrangement, enjoyable in its own way. Max, burdened by financial woes post-divorce, couldn't resist when Oscar proposed a substantial kickback for a lucrative deal involving a new insurance area. Despite Sandra's shock, Max succumbed to the offer, receiving an advance he promptly spent. However, Oscar's final conditions, revealed later, included a night with Sandra. Initially resisting, Sandra succumbed to Max's persuasions after Oscar threatened to expose Max's corruption if he did not comply. After the intervention of my lawyer and myself led to the cancellation of the insurance policy, Sandra decided that the issue was resolved. But Oscar insisted on getting what he had already paid for, as agreed, for Friday evening. Sandra didn't want to have anything to do with Oscar, so she even suggested to Max that she would borrow from her parents to pay this money to Oscar. However, Oscar sought revenge against me, compelling Max to confess that he insisted on nothing less than his prepaid night with Sandra. During their Friday lunch, Max had informed her that Oscar had consented to forego any deviations and implored her to comply just this once. He suggested she do it at her own summer house, where Oscar lacked surveillance cameras. Despite harboring doubts, she yielded to Max's pleas and reluctantly agreed to spend that one night with Oscar, solely to safeguard their jobs. I had no reason to question her when she confessed that evening was the biggest mistake of her life. She still occasionally suffered terrible nightmares about it, even though Oscar hadn't reached out to her since a brief phone call later that same night, inquiring about his clothes. She gave me a strange look when I assured her I'd persuaded Oscar to behave and that he wouldn't bother her again. But frankly, I didn't care if he did something to Max. She looked after Max for a few days after he was in pretty bad shape from my beating. Instead of intimacy, they engaged in heated arguments, with her blaming him for ruining her marriage and him accusing her of being so desperate for the promotion that she did things a faithful wife wouldn't. She regretted their affair immensely. Just a fortnight after I confronted Max, the district chief suffered a stroke, leading to their replacement by an official from headquarters. This new chief probed into Max's dealings with Oscar and subsequently ousted him, offering the ultimatum of termination or a menial role in a remote northern office. Max assured me he hadn't divulged any details regarding our negotiations with Oscar to the new chief. Sandra didn't feel Max's absence at all when he departed for the north, as she had assumed his role as department head. However, due to reorganization, her position had slightly diminished in significance. Despite reaching the highest position ever held by a woman in the district office, she admitted that the sacrifices she made to get there weren't worthwhile. Many nights were spent in remorseful tears, fearing for her job's future, and plagued by nightmares about the new district chief, whose behavior towards her made her feel like he saw her as an object. Sandra expressed her dream of rekindling our relationship, but she came to terms with its impossibility. She found solace in going on 2 dates with a kind man, planning to be honest with him about her past and let him decide if her background or future mattered more to him. If the new district chief made any advances, she preferred to create a scandal and leave her job. I wished her luck in her new endeavors. 2 months after Marie-Anne and her children joined Lena and me in my home, we were enjoying life as a blissful family. Laughter and joy filled our home constantly. Our Friday evening family gatherings became such amusing occasions that none of the children wanted to miss them by visiting their other parent on that day. Once again, I was a content man with a wife I deeply loved.